Today we're going to be thinking about chemistry. In order to think about that, we have to start with the very basics. We have to think about what the world is made of and why those parts of the world and the rest of the universe behave the way that they do, and have the interactions and the properties that they have. So the first thing that I want to talk about is what we're going to call matter. And we're going to define matter as anything that takes up space and has mass. So if you think about the air, water, tables, cars, people, rocks, all of those things would be matter. It takes up space. It has substance to it. As long as we're using that word mass there, I'd like to go ahead and define that also. It's just the amount of matter in an object, so how much stuff there is there. That mass is going to vary depending on what we're talking about. So if you think about the air, there's not a lot of mass there because it's not very dense. It's kind of all spread out. On the other hand, if we're thinking about something like water, a lot of that material is real densely packed, so we have a greater amount of mass in that same amount of area. The matter is made up of things that are called elements. And elements are the smallest pieces of matter that have those qualities, those chemical qualities of that material. So things can't be broken down any farther by chemical reactions, can't be chemically broken down any farther. The elements are probably things that you're familiar with. There's about 92 of them that occur in nature. You'll hear these names. Things like sodium, carbon, gold, those would all be examples of elements. Because those names sometimes are kind of long, we will use abbreviations, symbols for them. So sodium, the symbol is Na. That one's not real obvious. It comes from one of those Latin or Greek words, or one of those languages nobody speaks anymore. Natrium, I think, is the term for sodium. Carbon, it's an easy one. Symbol C. It's often just that first letter. If there's no overlap with other elements. Gold is Au, and we're going to use those to kind of keep track of which elements we're talking about. Uniquely apply to those elements and to no other element. If we think about something with which we're really familiar, living organisms, what we find is that life is made up of mostly 4 elements. Those are carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And 96% of your body is made up of those 4 things. Some of those are more than others. Oxygen is a big part of that. So 65% of your body is made up of oxygen. That doesn't mean that the other things aren't important, just that a very large proportion, almost 2/3 of your body, is made up of oxygen. There are also other things that we're going to call trace elements. When you look at the nutrition facts on the cereal box, you'll see some of these things. Things that aren't carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, or nitrogen, but are important for you to be alive. So they're really needed, but they're only needed in very small amounts. So you don't have to have a big part of your body made up of them, but you need to have them to stay alive. All right, these elements that we've been talking about are found in these small particles that we're going to call atoms. We're going to say an atom is the smallest unit of matter, the smallest piece that we could have, that still has the properties of that element that we're talking about. So this is the minimum piece that can still be a piece of gold, for example. That single atom of gold will still have all those properties of gold, all those things that we think about, but it's made up of just a single smallest piece. The atoms that we're talking about are going to behave, they're going to react, they're going to interact with other things, depending on the specific properties. And those properties are determined by the structure. So we have to think about what's inside that atom. Why is gold different than carbon, which is different from oxygen? What is it about that structure that makes that difference? The structure comes from particles that are smaller than the atom. So we're going to call these subatomic particles. We're not going to go into all the details about all the different types of extreme subatomic particles, quarks and bosons, and all kinds of weird words we don't use very much. But there are 3 that are really important that we need to understand. Those 3 are neutrons, protons, and electrons. So these are the three primary subatomic particles. And these are going to differ from each other based on two main components. Their electrical charge, so that is whether they are positive, negative, or neutral, and then their size, how big or small they are. Now, these are subatomic particles, so they're all going to be small, but it turns out that there's actually a pretty big size difference when we compare some of them to each other. All right, so let's start out with a neutron. That's going to be the first of our subatomic particles. Neutrons are neutral in electrical charge, and in size, they're big for a subatomic particle. Protons are going to be positive in electrical charge and are also big for a subatomic particle, about the same size as a neutron. Finally, our third type of subatomic particle then are the electrons. Electrons are our negative subatomic particle, and comparatively to a neutron or a proton are very, very, very small. So these are tiny little particles. The number and the types of these particles inside of an atom is what results in those properties. All right, so let's look at that. Let's look at an atom and let's look at what that structure looks like. Here's an example from the textbook. And so we can see in our example subatomic particle here that we can see our example atom here, we can see those three subatomic particles, the neutrons, the protons, and the electrons. And one of the things that you might notice here is that the protons and neutrons are right in the middle. So right in the middle, we call that the nucleus. And the nucleus contains the protons and the neutrons. So those big subatomic particles are concentrated right there in the middle. We can see then that around that is where the electrons are going to be found. So in the middle, we have the nucleus, and then on the outside, we have the electrons. This example here is not to scale at all. So something that's kind of surprising, this is the sort of drawing, if you've ever taken a chemistry class or heard anybody talk about physics, this is often the sort of drawing that we'll put together. The neutrons and the protons and the electrons circling around them. And that's right, but the amount of empty space is not very well represented here. In reality, if we really had a true representation of the relative sizes of these things, it'd be very, very difficult to have a diagrammatic drawing like this. In reality, if we looked at something we might be familiar with from everyday life to sort of represent the structure of an atom, if you took a pencil eraser and put it at home plate in a baseball stadium, that pencil eraser would represent the nucleus. And then the electrons would be circling around the outside of the stadium, right? Like at the outfield wall, around and around and around the nucleus. And all that empty space, all that space with nothing, it turns out that that's what atoms are really like. That they're mainly empty space. That they're mainly not made of anything. There's just a lot of space between the electrons and that nucleus. The atom is going to be held together by the charges, with electrons being negatively charged, protons being positively charged. And so those positive and negatives are going to be attracted to each other. And that attraction then, that is what keeps the electrons from flying away and no longer being associated with that atom. So those positive and negatives are being held together sort of like a magnet attracting steel. The same thing's going to be happening here, except the steel's not going to get pulled all the way to the magnet. The electrons are going to keep circling and circling. Sort of like if you think about the moon circling around the Earth, right? The gravitation of the Earth is keeping the moon going around and around and around it. Same thing's happening with electrons. They're circling around and around and around. The size that I mentioned before, I wanted to be a bit more specific here, just to sort of impress you with the size we're actually talking about. We're going to define the size here by what we're going to call the atomic mass unit, which we usually abbreviate as AMU. If we look at our subatomic particles and think about their sizes in this very small unit of mass, what we find is that protons and neutrons we define as being about 1. So pretty close to a single atomic mass unit. Electrons, in comparison, are about 1/2000th AMU. So very, 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 very tiny compared to the subatomic particles in that nucleus. Again, in our diagram, we can't represent this very well, because if we drew our electrons at 1/2000th the size of our neutrons and protons, we wouldn't even be able to see them. But just know that they're very, 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 very small. All right, when we think about our structure of our atoms, when we think about those subatomic particles that make up that atom, what we're going to be concentrating on to figure out what sort of element we are seeing, or the properties that it would have, we're going to start thinking about the number of protons. So protons, you remember, are those positively charged subatomic particles. And each element was going to have a specific number of protons. That's going to be unique to that element. We call that number of protons the atomic number. And so as soon as we know an atomic number, we know which element we're talking about. We usually will write this as a subscript to the left of the symbol. So for example, if we're talking about something like oxygen, you see that has that 8 below and to the left there. That 8 is because oxygen has 8 protons. So any atom that has 8 protons is oxygen. Oxygen always has 8 protons. Okay, so that's a way to keep track of exactly what element we're talking about by knowing the number of protons. Usually, we won't write this 8 here because it's just sort of implied. As soon as we see that we're talking about oxygen, we know there's going to be 8. That it's going to be predictable, consistent, that it has to be oxygen if there's going to be 8. But it's there, we know it's there, we can keep track of it. Atoms, in their natural state, are neutral in their electrical charge. What that means is that if we know the number of protons, which have 1 unit of positive charge, that means we're going to know the number of electrons, because the number of protons and the number of electrons are going to have to equal each other. That if there are, in our example here on the right of our diagram, we see that there are 2 protons, so 2 units of positive electrical charge. That means that we're going to have to be 2 units of negative electrical charge, which is provided by 2 electrons. So it's going to be a balance there. So as soon as we know how many protons there are, we already know a lot about this specific element, because we know how many electrons there will be when it's electrically neutral. Now, if we had this situation where we had more electrons, then we could have an atom that becomes negatively charged, which we might call an ion. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. If we had an atom that had more protons or fewer electrons, then we could have a positively charged ion. So that is the basics of the subatomic structure. Next time we're going to talk a little bit more about that and see how that applies to the actual chemical behavior of these elements and controls how they do what they do and why they do it.